We all know that commercial real estate is kind of it's kind of an old boys club out there. So I imagine that the words that you will not say today have been spoken on many a deal.
Yes, no, at least in the back room. in the deal's like son of a beep gun. Yeah. So anyway,
so Matt, I was just talking about all the information that's out there and how people really do, focus on the things that either they can handle or is important to them. And when it comes down to, I think, anybody with owning a business, starting a business, looking at different pieces of real estate, you must see the same things where people are only listening or hearing what they want to hear.
Yeah, and it whether it's on a global basis or on a very myopic, looking through a straw basis. Sometimes, whether you're watching the Kardashians or CNN or whatever, you're looking at global versus narrow. When you're looking at a transaction, that's reality, and that's going to be documented in a contract, in an agreement, a letter of intent, whatever. There is reality, and then there is what you want. And the broker's job, whether it be residential or commercial, is to try to get the tenant or the buyer's reality lined up with the reality of the seller. And sometimes those aren't always clear from the beginning. But that's when you go through the negotiation process. That's why you hire a professional to help you pilot through that. And the buyer's expectations or the leasee's expectation oftentimes is different because they're looking at their world through their checking account or their bank or their business operations. And
their wife in their ear, their kids going to college the next year, right? The things that are really infecting them.
Yes, and the wife wants a vacation, the husband wants a vacation, whoever it is, and it's like, well, I got to, trim $1,000 a month off my operating expenses. And, that's the easiest way to do it versus let's be more productive.
Now, Bob and John have to share an office and, right, the whole
important
thing.
Things.
Right.
Yeah, the important things. But it's important to Bob and John, and they will rail
right.
that they get their own offices.
Right.
But in the whole scheme of things, when you're looking at setting up the negotiation, that's why it's good to sit down with your real estate professional, again, residential or commercial, and talk about what your needs are, your wants are, and your sure like to haves. Mm-hmm. Because part of the agent's or the broker's job is to set those expectations with your client because their expectations may not always line up with what the seller or the landlord's expectations are. There's a lot, it depends on the property and everything, and I hate even saying that word depends because everything is so fluid in all business. But sometimes the landlords, and we've talked about this on previous shows, where they're locked into they have to achieve this certain rate or this certain economics.
And that could be a bank. I think you've said before that could actually be a bank requirement.
Yeah, it's a lender requirement that they have to perform or have to strike a certain performa on a property. And the landlord is not allowed to execute a lease that's south of that baseline performa. So informing your client of those types of situations that you could run into kind of helps prepare them for when the landlord is not being maybe real. The expectations aren't lining up. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And if you explain that to them up front, then it's easier to break that news to them or show them that's where we're at in the transaction. Mm-hmm. But when you're negotiating, that's how you set the whole thing up going forward. And if you do it, like we said before, if you do it once every 3 to 5 years, you're just not going to be as skilled at it as the landlord. And we've talked, this kind of reiteration of many shows.
Sure. But when you talk about setting it up, I mean, right, so you have this kind of reality that maybe, if you're on two sides of the fence.
Yeah.
Right? If somebody's leasing and somebody's renting.
Right.
You're on two sides of the fence. The reality is also that the other person, you may not know what's on the other side of the fence.
Absolutely. You don't know what they're facing. You don't know what, if they're underwater, if they're losing major tenants, what the landlord or the lessee's financial condition is until you get to that final stroking of the pen. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
And so I would imagine that having a broker there to try to, I guess, help people understand what's really going on in the world of that one transaction can be huge because, I think you can always find out vacancy rates, Right.
That's anywhere.
You can always find out, hey, this, if you live in Kirkland, Google just came in. Pretty big company. Google's probably going to build some more buildings there, right? Correct. And that's easy to find out.
Yes.
But if you want to rent a building next to Google, you may not know. I mean, obviously that building owner isn't Google, no. And you may not know exactly what that is going to do for that owner or what's going through their world. And so there's these kind of I think what I'm hearing you say is there's these kind of microcosms of what's going on within the larger
absolutely
market.
In that scenario itself, if you're in Kirkland or Redmond or next to Microsoft.
I never leave Kirkland other than to come here, so
but,
that's my only frame of reference.
But if my philosophy sometimes too is try to wear the other guy's shoes a little bit. So if you were the landlord, the building owner, and you had a decent building right next to Google, and you know that the Google ratio or the Microsoft ratio in the Northwest is 4 or 5 jobs for every 1 job of Google, one job at Microsoft. If you were that building owner, you'd say, hey, my rates just went up because I know there's service providers to this major corporation that want to be across the street to show their dedication to their client, yada, yada. And so now the rates in that building just got less flexible. There's less TIs. There's less concessions by the landlord because it's a more popular building. It's, again, real estate, location, and location.
Sure.
And if you're next to one of those powerhouses and your team can walk across the street, you've just saved time, money, everything. So in that scenario laid out, yeah, that building's going to be more expensive. Crosstown, it'll be the standard rate. But when you're looking at those types of negotiations, that's what you need a broker to help you do is kind of do the lay of the land, figure out, what your company, again, wants, needs, and would like to have. And then you go through those because every one of those has a dollar value to it, both to the landlord and to the tenant. And if sometimes those are skewed, they're different values to either party. But in the end, you try to flatline that and say, hey, this is the mid-ground. This is where we're at. Is that going to work for you?
And I imagine, when you come from a tenant standpoint, there could be how far they have to drive in the morning that comes into play. I mean, things that, of course, are going to be very unbeknownst to somebody else.
Yes. Well, this is off the record here. On the record.
Pretty on.
On the record.
It's pretty on.
But in my 20-some years experience here, most of the perfect buildings, most of the perfect, locations for any company is within probably 10 to 15 minutes of the decision maker's house.
I would imagine.
It's one of the perks of the job. So if they're or near their health club or the golf club or something like that.
Something that they can get to something else quickly.
Yes, that's convenient for them. Now, granted, they're the decision maker, and that's their right to do that. But and the rest of it, you have 100 employees, and they stretch from Arlington to Tacoma. You're not going to make everybody happy.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as you start to go through these different processes with people, we just have about a minute left, Matt. But as you start to go through these processes with landlords and tenants, how early do some of these wants, needs, want-to-haves come up in the conversation? Because I know, at least in residential, and we've talked about this at length, is a lot of people think they want something, and all of a sudden they end up buying something that's quite different.
Yes. Kind of depends a lot. There's that word again. Depends on the economics, because people say, what can I get for this? And then they find out that, well, their reality isn't quite what the market reality is. But when you're setting that up early on, you go through that checklist. What do you need, have to have? In residential, it's school districts, number one. Number one in commercial is it have the right size, space, configuration? Is it going to be good for morale? Is there parking? Are there amenities to where the employees can go across the street and get lunch and come back if they need to? So there's a lot of those little things in there. And when you sit down with your client, you just go through each one of those, what's important. It's good to have a lay of land of what their existing layout is, because a lot of times they want drastic change or not so much change. They just have to move. So that's what you set up. And if it depends on the square footage. So if you're in, general rule, I guess, 3,000 and less square feet for office or industrial, you want to start 4 or 5 months ahead of time. If you're in the 10,000 square foot range or above, you want to start a year, 12 months before that, because you have to pay attention to the timing of the deal, the timing of the economy, what the business is doing. You don't want to move on a month-end close or quarter close, whatever. So those are some of the things that you have to kind of map out way in advance so you can follow a nice methodical.
So your accounting department doesn't get mad as they're trying to do the books, and here you are, Here you are like, all right, everybody up and let's get out of here.
Here's your box. Let's go.